Park with the employees. I can't let Preston see me arriving in this truck. Claire Whitmore never raised her voice. Yet somehow those words landed harder than the steady rain drumming across the windshield of the aging blue Ford F-150. The windshield wipers swept left and right in slow rhythm, pushing away silver ribbons of water that reflected the towering entrance of Whitmore Crown Grand Hotel, where golden lights shimmered across polished stone and rows of luxury cars stretched beneath the glowing porte cochere. A valet in a crisp navy uniform hurried toward a black Rolls-Royce, while photographers gathered near the red carpet, waiting for Charleston's most influential business leaders to arrive for the annual Legacy Foundation Gala. Daniel Whitmore rested both hands quietly on the steering wheel. He didn't answer. He simply watched the enormous bronze crown above the entrance catch the rain, its familiar outline softened by the evening mist. 22 years earlier, he had sketched that same crown on the back of a diner napkin with a borrowed pencil while eating pancakes that cost less than $3. Tonight, almost no one standing outside knew that story. Claire adjusted the pearl earrings she had spent nearly an hour choosing. She glanced again toward the crowd gathered beneath the hotel lights and caught sight of Preston Hale laughing with several investors near the entrance. Her shoulders stiffened. "Please," she said more quietly, smoothing the sleeve of her elegant navy gown. "Just drive around back. I'll meet everyone at the front." Daniel finally turned toward her, his expression calm, almost gentle. "You're embarrassed by the truck?" Claire avoided his eyes for only a heartbeat. "I'm embarrassed by the impression." She forced a polite smile that never reached her eyes. "People notice these things." Daniel looked back through the rain-speckled windshield. Beyond the expensive cars, he noticed something no one else seemed to see. A gray-haired kitchen employee hurried across the driveway carrying 2 heavy boxes beneath a thin plastic poncho, while guests stepped from luxury SUVs beneath oversized umbrellas held by hotel attendants. The employee smiled politely at every passing guest despite the rain soaking the cuffs of his work pants. Daniel had always admired people who kept smiling when no one was watching. "I'll park in the back," he said softly. Relief crossed Claire's face almost instantly. "Thank you. I'll tell everyone you're coming in later." She reached for the door handle before pausing. "And maybe, leave your jacket in the truck." Daniel glanced down at the faded brown canvas jacket folded neatly beside him. It had a tiny stitched repair near one elbow. He remembered the day it had torn while helping install furniture in the hotel's very first lobby. He smiled almost imperceptibly. "It's comfortable," he replied. Claire sighed, then opened the door. Cool rain drifted inside before she stepped carefully beneath the covered entrance, instantly blending into the elegant crowd as though she had always belonged there. Daniel watched her disappear beneath sparkling chandeliers visible through towering glass windows. Then he shifted the truck into drive and followed the signs pointing toward employee parking. The farther he drove from the main entrance, the quieter everything became. Music from the ballroom faded into distant echoes. Decorative landscaping gave way to delivery docks, service elevators, and rows of practical sedans lined neatly beneath soft security lights. Rainwater collected along the pavement, reflecting the glow from loading bays where cooks, housekeepers, engineers, and maintenance workers entered through a plain gray doorway without cameras, applause, or photographers waiting outside. Daniel pulled into an empty parking space and switched off the engine. For a moment, only the ticking sound of cooling metal filled the truck. He rested his hand on the old stainless steel watch around his wrist. The scratched crystal caught a faint reflection from a nearby light pole. The engraving on the back had nearly worn smooth after decades of daily use, but Daniel still knew every letter without looking. It had been given to him by the first 20 employees who believed in a dream before anyone else did. They had pooled their savings to buy it after the hotel's grand opening. Daniel never replaced it with anything more expensive because nothing else had ever carried more value. He stepped out into the cool evening air, slipped on the weathered canvas jacket, and locked the truck with a quiet click. Across the parking lot, a young valet jogged through the rain toward him, slowing as his eyes settled on Daniel's face, then on the old watch glinting beneath the cuff of his jacket. The young man's footsteps stopped completely. His expression shifted from routine professionalism to stunned disbelief, as though a forgotten memory had suddenly come rushing back after years of silence. The young valet stood perfectly still as rain collected on the shoulders of his navy jacket. For a brief moment, the sounds of the loading dock faded beneath the steady rhythm of water dripping from the edge of the service entrance. Daniel Whitmore noticed the young man's widened eyes, but said nothing. Recognition often arrived quietly. It rarely needed an announcement. The valet swallowed before speaking in a voice that barely rose above the ring. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore." Daniel looked at him with a calm smile. "Good evening." The young man blinked twice, almost as if confirming that he was not imagining what he saw. "I am Owen, sir." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "I remember your last name." Surprise flashed across Owen's face. "You do?" Daniel nodded. "Your father worked construction during the renovation of our first property outside Savannah. He always carried photographs of you in his lunchbox." Owen's eyes softened immediately. "He passed away 3 years ago." "I know," Daniel answered gently. "I was sorry to hear it." Neither man spoke for several seconds. The rain continued falling between them, while delivery trucks backed carefully toward the service docks. Finally, Owen reached for the truck keys, then hesitated. "Sir, should I bring your truck to the front entrance?" Daniel slowly closed Owen's fingers around the keys before shaking his head. "Not tonight." Owen looked confused. "But everyone inside should know you are here." Daniel glanced toward the brightly lit hotel towering above the employee parking lot. "That is exactly what I would like to learn." Owen followed Daniel's gaze. Through the glass walls of the ballroom, crystal chandeliers glowed like floating stars. Laughter drifted faintly across the wet pavement. "I do not understand, sir." Daniel smiled. "Sometimes a building tells you more when nobody realizes the owner is listening." Owen lowered his voice. "Then, I will keep your arrival private." Daniel gave a small nod. "Thank you." Owen carefully slipped the truck keys into his pocket instead of placing them on the valet rack. "I will personally look after it." Daniel rested a hand briefly on the young man's shoulder. "I believe you will." As Daniel turned toward the employee entrance, a security guard stepped in front of the service hallway. The guard looked politely at Daniel's weathered jacket before checking the identification badge hanging around every employee's neck. Daniel wore none. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said respectfully. "This entrance is for staff only." Daniel smiled. "I understand." Before he could step away, Owen quickly approached. "He is with me." The guard looked uncertain. "Another new vendor?" Owen answered without hesitation. "Special guest." The guard immediately stepped aside. "Of course. Enjoy your evening." Daniel glanced at Owen with quiet appreciation, but said nothing. They walked together through the wide service corridor where polished concrete floors replaced imported marble. The scent of fresh bread drifted from the bakery, while cooks moved efficiently between stainless steel counters. Housekeepers pushed neatly organized linen carts toward waiting elevators. Engineers discussed maintenance schedules over tablets, while a florist carefully arranged white roses destined for the ballroom upstairs. Nobody here cared about luxury watches, expensive cars, or designer suits. Everyone simply focused on doing their work well. Daniel slowed his pace. Every greeting echoed with genuine warmth. Every employee thanked another before disappearing into the next task. He watched a dishwasher help an elderly pastry chef carry heavy trays without being asked. Nearby, a young hostess carefully adjusted a wheelchair ramp for an older banquet server before returning to her own assignment. Small acts of kindness quietly unfolded everywhere. Daniel had always believed culture was never created inside boardrooms. It was built in hallways like these. Owen noticed him observing everything. Most guests never see this part of the hotel. Daniel smiled faintly. "It is my favorite part." They reached an employee elevator where several workers waited patiently. Nobody recognized Daniel. A few nodded politely before continuing quiet conversations about children, weekend fishing trips, and high school football games. Daniel listened more than he spoke. Those ordinary conversations reminded him why he had started the company decades earlier. Hotels were never really about buildings. They were about people creating moments for strangers they would probably never meet again. As the elevator climbed toward the ballroom level, Owen's expression gradually became more serious. He looked around carefully before speaking in almost a whisper. "Sir, there is something you should probably know before you walk upstairs." Daniel turned toward him. Owen hesitated, choosing every word with obvious care. For the past 2 weeks, several executives have been requesting confidential property records that they never asked for before. They keep saying it is routine, but it does not feel routine. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Elegant music floated into the corridor. Guests laughed somewhere beyond the polished wooden doors leading toward the gala. Owen met Daniel's eyes one final time. "I do not know exactly what is happening, sir. I only know something inside this hotel has changed." Daniel stepped out of the elevator without changing his pace. The ballroom corridor shimmered beneath warm crystal lights, where polished marble reflected elegant gowns, tailored tuxedos, and servers carrying silver trays filled with sparkling glasses. A string quartet played softly near the entrance, blending into conversations about investments, charitable foundations, and expansion plans. Daniel walked through the crowd with the quiet confidence of a man who had never needed attention to know his own worth. Nobody greeted him by name. Nobody offered a handshake. A few guests glanced at his worn canvas jacket before looking away, quietly deciding that he must belong somewhere behind the scenes. Daniel noticed every glance without taking offense. Years earlier, before success had ever found him, he had learned that people often revealed more about themselves during the first 5 seconds than they realized. Across the ballroom, Claire stood beside Preston Hale beneath an enormous floral arrangement of white roses and fresh eucalyptus. Preston laughed easily as several investors gathered around him, speaking with the polished certainty of a man accustomed to being admired. Claire smiled at the right moments, occasionally touching Preston's arm to emphasize a point before accepting another compliment about the evening's event. She looked completely at home beneath the ballroom lights. Daniel remained several yards away, unnoticed, observing the room rather than participating in it. Every detail mattered. The servers moved with remarkable precision. The musicians never missed a note. Guests complimented the hotel, without realizing the man responsible for its culture stood quietly among them, wearing a jacket they had already judged. Near one side of the ballroom, Daniel noticed an elderly banquet employee struggling to reposition a decorative display that had shifted slightly away from the wall. Before anyone else reacted, Daniel walked over and steadied the heavy arrangement while the employee adjusted its base. "Thank you," the older man said warmly. "These flowers always seem lighter during setup than they do afterward." Daniel smiled. "They probably grow heavier after everyone starts watching." The employee laughed softly. "That sounds about right." Without another word, Daniel stepped back into the crowd. No applause followed. No recognition came. Yet the small exchange reminded him why genuine character rarely needed an audience. A few minutes later, Claire finally spotted him standing near one of the ballroom columns. For the briefest instant, surprise crossed her face. Then she quickly composed herself as Preston turned in Daniel's direction. Instead of waving him over, Claire offered only the faintest nod before returning her attention to the investors surrounding her. Daniel understood immediately. She hoped he would remain invisible. He honored her wish without resentment. Nearby, 2 executives discussed the hotel's future expansion while reviewing digital renderings on a tablet. Daniel slowed as he passed close enough to overhear fragments of their conversation. "If the transition happens tonight, the restructuring could begin before the end of the quarter," one man whispered. The other glanced toward Preston before answering. "Everything depends on the signatures." Daniel continued walking without changing his expression, but Owen's warning echoed clearly in his thoughts. Confidential property records. Unusual requests. Something inside the hotel had changed. At the opposite end of the ballroom, a large display featured framed photographs celebrating the company's history. Guests admired elegant images of ribbon cuttings, grand openings, and charitable events spanning more than 2 decades. One young couple paused before the oldest photograph, showing a much smaller hotel with a modest staff standing proudly beside its entrance. The picture included a younger Daniel wearing blue jeans, work boots, and the very same stainless steel watch resting beneath his jacket sleeve tonight. "I wonder who that guy was," the woman asked. Her companion shrugged. "Probably one of the contractors." Daniel smiled quietly as he continued walking. He had never minded being underestimated. Sometimes it offered the clearest view of another person's heart. Suddenly, Margaret Sloan appeared near the ballroom entrance, greeting donors with her usual professionalism. As general manager, she carried herself with calm authority, yet Daniel noticed something unusual. Her eyes briefly met his across the crowded room before immediately shifting away, as though she deliberately chose not to acknowledge him. She knew he was here. She also understood he wanted to remain unnoticed. Her discipline confirmed why he had trusted her for so many years. Moments later, a master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone to the evening's gala. The room gradually settled into attentive silence as guests found their seats. Claire joined Preston at a reserved table near the front, while Daniel selected an empty chair toward the back beside several hotel employees who had been invited to recognize their years of service. None of them recognized the quiet man sitting among them. They simply welcomed him with polite smiles and made room at the table. Daniel thanked them sincerely. As applause filled the ballroom following the opening remarks, he looked toward the stage, then briefly toward the elegant leather portfolio resting beside Preston's chair. Preston placed one hand on it almost protectively before exchanging a confident smile with Claire. Daniel noticed the gesture immediately. He had seen executives guard contracts that way many times before. Whatever documents rested inside that portfolio clearly mattered. Then, from the service entrance across the ballroom, Daniel caught sight of Owen standing perfectly still, his face unusually tense as he looked first toward Preston, then toward the stage, and finally toward Daniel himself. Owen was no longer simply watching the gala. He was waiting for the exact moment when remaining silent would no longer be the right choice. The applause gradually faded as the master of ceremonies welcomed another distinguished guest to the stage, but Daniel's attention remained fixed on the leather portfolio resting beside Preston Hale's chair. Years of building companies had taught him that people often protected paperwork more carefully than they protected their words. Contracts revealed intentions that polished speeches rarely admitted. Preston leaned toward Claire and whispered something that made her smile politely before she nodded in agreement. Daniel could not hear the conversation, yet he recognized the expression on Claire's face. It was the same determined look she wore whenever she believed she was standing one step closer to the future she imagined for herself. The orchestra resumed playing softly while servers began placing the first course before each guest. Crystal glasses reflected warm candlelight across the ballroom, creating an atmosphere of effortless elegance. Daniel accepted a glass of sparkling water from a young server and thanked her by name after reading the embroidered tag on her uniform. She blinked with pleasant surprise before smiling. "Thank you for noticing," she said quietly. "Most people never do." Daniel returned the smile. "Everyone deserves to be addressed by their name." She walked away carrying her tray a little more confidently than before. At the front of the ballroom, Preston rose from his chair to greet several members of the hotel's advisory board. His voice carried naturally through the room as he discussed innovation, expansion, and exciting opportunities for future investors. He spoke with enough confidence to make every promise sound inevitable. Claire listened with admiration, occasionally introducing Preston to donors who had traveled from Atlanta, Charlotte, and Nashville. She looked proud to stand beside him, believing she was helping shape the next chapter of the company. Daniel quietly wished she had asked herself who would actually write that chapter. As dinner continued, Margaret Sloan circulated through the ballroom, checking every detail with the calm precision that had earned the respect of employees throughout the organization. When she reached Daniel's table, she greeted every guest warmly before allowing herself only the briefest glance in his direction. Her professionalism never wavered. She understood that acknowledging him publicly before the proper moment would change everything. Daniel appreciated her restraint. Across the room, Owen remained near the service entrance, but he was no longer simply observing the event. Daniel noticed him discreetly watching two men in expensive suits who had stepped into a quiet hallway beside the ballroom. One of them was Preston's executive assistant. The other wore a visitor identification badge rather than an employee credential. Owen frowned slightly as the assistant handed the visitor a small envelope before both men disappeared around the corner. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it clearly unsettled him. Daniel followed the direction of Owen's gaze without attracting attention. Something about the timing felt wrong. A few minutes later, Preston approached the stage after being introduced as one of the evening's principal benefactors. The audience applauded enthusiastically while he thanked the foundation for its charitable work and spoke passionately about leadership, responsibility, and building legacies that would endure for generations. His speech was polished and inspiring. Daniel listened carefully, not because he believed every word, but because he believed every speech eventually revealed its speaker. Near the end of his remarks, Preston smiled confidently and said, Tonight represents more than a celebration of generosity. It also marks the beginning of an exciting new partnership that will strengthen this remarkable institution for decades to come. Several guests exchanged curious looks before applauding once again. Claire joined the applause immediately, her eyes shining with anticipation. Daniel remained still. He noticed Margaret's posture tighten almost imperceptibly. She knew exactly what Preston was implying. When Preston returned to his table, Claire leaned closer to him. Daniel could not hear her words, but he saw Preston slide the leather portfolio slightly toward her before opening it just enough for her to review several pages inside. Claire studied the documents carefully, then reached for a pen resting beside her dinner plate. Daniel felt no anger, only quiet disappointment. He had not yet seen the papers, but Owen's warning and Preston's confidence were beginning to align into a troubling picture. At that same moment, Owen emerged from the service hallway carrying a small stack of guest folders. As he passed behind Preston's table, his eyes briefly settled on the open portfolio. His expression changed instantly. He lowered his head before anyone noticed, but Daniel saw the concern on the young man's face. Owen continued walking until he reached Margaret near the ballroom entrance. He whispered something into her ear. Margaret listened without interrupting, then looked toward Preston, then toward Daniel. For the first time that evening, genuine worry crossed her composed expression. She quietly instructed another manager to oversee the ballroom before disappearing with Owen into the administrative corridor. Daniel understood they had discovered something important. He folded his hands calmly on the table and waited. He had spent decades learning that truth rarely benefited from being rushed. Sometimes the strongest move was not to interrupt a carefully constructed plan, but to let it unfold just far enough for everyone to see it clearly. As conversations resumed, and the orchestra played another elegant melody, Daniel glanced once more toward the corridor where Margaret and Owen had disappeared. Less than a minute later, the ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the master of ceremonies returned to the stage with an unexpected announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with an enthusiastic smile, "before our keynote presentation, we have one special document to recognize this evening." Daniel slowly lifted his eyes toward the stage while Preston reached confidently for his portfolio, completely unaware that somewhere behind the ballroom doors, the evening had already begun to change. The ballroom settled into an expectant silence as every guest turned toward the stage. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow across polished tables, while the orchestra lowered its volume until only the soft sound of a piano remained. Preston Hale adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket with complete confidence. Claire offered him an encouraging smile, believing the evening was unfolding exactly as planned. Daniel remained seated near the back beside the long-serving employees, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. Years earlier, he had learned that patience often uncovered truths that confrontation never could. The master of ceremonies smiled at the audience before continuing. "This evening has always been about honoring leadership that creates opportunities for others. Before we continue with our keynote presentation, Mr. Preston Hale has requested a brief acknowledgement regarding the future of Whitmore Crown." Polite applause echoed through the room. Preston rose smoothly from his chair, picked up the leather portfolio, and walked toward the stage with practiced confidence. Several cameras turned in his direction. Claire watched proudly from her seat as though she already knew history was about to be written. Preston reached the podium and thanked everyone for their generosity before placing the portfolio on the lectern. "Great organizations thrive when visionary leadership embraces bold partnerships," he began. "Tonight, we celebrate not only charitable giving, but also a shared commitment to the future." His words flowed effortlessly. Investors nodded in approval while guests exchanged impressed smiles. Daniel listened carefully, noticing that Preston never once mentioned the employees whose work had built the hotel's reputation. He spoke about assets, growth, expansion, and influence, but never about people. That omission mattered more than anything else he had said. As Preston continued speaking, Daniel quietly looked around the ballroom. Several longtime employees sat near him because they had been invited to recognize decades of loyal service. One banquet supervisor had worked for the company for nearly 20 years. Another housekeeper had trained 3 generations of hospitality staff. They applauded politely, unaware that decisions affecting their futures might already be sitting inside the portfolio on the stage. Daniel folded his hands together. Those employees had trusted the company with their careers. Whatever happened next needed to honor that trust. At the rear of the ballroom doors, Owen returned beside Margaret Sloane. Neither of them interrupted the presentation. Margaret carried a slim black folder against her side, while Owen remained unusually composed despite the concern still visible in his eyes. Margaret briefly caught Daniel's attention across the room. She did not speak. She simply gave the smallest possible nod. Daniel understood immediately. They had confirmed something. Preston opened the leather portfolio and removed several documents. I am honored to announce an agreement that will position this remarkable property for unprecedented success. Applause broke out once again before he even revealed the pages. Claire joined the applause enthusiastically. Daniel noticed that her excitement came from genuine belief rather than manipulation. She truly thought she was witnessing progress. That realization saddened him more than anger ever could. She had mistaken ambition for wisdom. Preston lifted the top page slightly, preparing to display it to the audience. Before he could continue, the ballroom microphone produced a soft tone. Margaret Sloane stepped calmly onto the stage from the side entrance. Her timing was respectful but unmistakably deliberate. The audience quieted immediately. Preston smiled politely, though a flicker of surprise crossed his face. "Margaret," he said, "we were just about to present the documents." Margaret returned the smile with flawless professionalism. "I know, Mr. Hale. Before those documents are introduced, there is a standard verification required under company governance." Preston's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Verification?" "Yes," Margaret replied calmly. "Every public announcement involving ownership interests or executive authority must be reviewed with the authorization of the controlling office." Several board members exchanged curious glances. Claire looked toward Preston, waiting for him to explain the unexpected interruption. Preston gave a light laugh. "I was assured everything had already been reviewed." Margaret answered with the same composed tone. "Someone may have assured you of that. Company policy requires something different." The room became noticeably quieter. Even the orchestra had stopped playing. Daniel watched without moving. He had written that policy himself nearly 2 decades earlier after a mentor warned him that integrity should never depend upon convenience. Margaret opened the black folder in her hands, but did not reveal its contents. Instead, she looked toward the audience. "The controlling office has requested that the presentation pause until one final verification is completed." Preston's confidence remained outwardly steady, but his fingers tightened slightly around the leather portfolio. Claire noticed the subtle change and looked at him with growing uncertainty. Around the ballroom, conversations faded into complete silence. Every guest sensed that the evening had taken an unexpected turn. Daniel slowly rose from his chair, not because anyone had called his name, but because he understood the moment that had quietly begun in the employee parking lot beneath the rain was finally approaching the point where appearances would no longer be able to hide the truth. Daniel walked forward at an unhurried pace, leaving his seat among the long-time employees as hundreds of eyes gradually followed him across the ballroom. The polished marble floor reflected the warm chandelier light beneath his worn leather shoes, creating a striking contrast between the quiet simplicity of the man and the elegance surrounding him. Most guests assumed he was simply another staff member responding to Margaret Sloane's request. A few frowned, wondering why someone dressed so modestly would approach the stage during such an important announcement. Claire noticed him immediately. Confusion crossed her face before concern quietly replaced it. She leaned toward Preston and whispered, "Why is Daniel walking up there?" Preston barely glanced in Daniel's direction before answering with casual confidence. "Probably some misunderstanding. Margaret will handle it." Daniel continued walking without changing his expression. Every step felt steady, neither hurried nor theatrical. He had spent decades believing that leadership was demonstrated through consistency, not spectacle. As he reached the front of the ballroom, Margaret stepped aside with quiet respect, creating just enough space for him to stand beside the podium. Preston looked politely puzzled. "Sir," he said with a courteous smile, "this portion of the program is reserved for executive business." Daniel returned the same calm smile. "I know." Preston waited for him to continue, but Daniel simply looked at the leather portfolio resting on the podium. After several silent seconds, he asked a single question. "May I see the documents?" Preston hesitated almost imperceptibly before answering. "These are confidential." Daniel nodded. "That is exactly why I should read them." A ripple of quiet conversation spread across the ballroom. Claire's heartbeat seemed almost visible in her expression. She still believed Daniel had wandered into a meeting beyond his understanding, yet something about Margaret's complete composure unsettled her. Margaret finally spoke. "Mr. Hale, company policy requires the documents to be reviewed by the controlling authority before any public acknowledgement." Preston looked towards several board members as though expecting support. Instead, they simply waited. None of them wished to challenge a written governance policy in front of so many respected guests. Preston slowly handed the portfolio to Margaret, who immediately placed it into Daniel's hands without hesitation. That single gesture transformed the atmosphere inside the ballroom. Daniel opened the portfolio carefully, turning each page with the patience of someone who had already suspected what he would find. The room remained completely silent except for the faint hum of the ballroom air conditioning. Claire watched every movement, unable to understand why Margaret treated her husband with such unmistakable respect. Daniel reached the final page and closed the folder gently. He looked up at Preston, not with anger, but with quiet disappointment. This proposal transfers operational authority over 3 flagship properties pending approval from the controlling shareholder. Preston answered confidently. "Correct. It creates tremendous opportunities for future expansion." Daniel nodded once. "It also allows extensive restructuring immediately after approval." Preston smiled. "Efficiency sometimes requires difficult decisions." Daniel's eyes shifted briefly toward the employees seated near the back of the ballroom. "How many positions disappear under your restructuring plan?" Preston remained silent for the first time that evening. Daniel did not raise his voice. 218. A wave of surprise spread through the audience. Several employees looked at one another in disbelief. Preston quickly recovered. "Those projections are preliminary." Daniel closed the portfolio once more. "The projections are detailed enough to list departments, dates, and estimated severance costs." Claire stared at Preston before looking back toward Daniel. Her expression slowly changed as pieces of the evening finally began fitting together. She had believed she was supporting a partnership that would strengthen the company. She had never imagined the proposal included eliminating the very people who had built its reputation. Preston attempted to regain control of the room. "With respect, you are discussing documents that have not yet been finalized." Daniel answered calmly. "Neither have the lives connected to those names." Silence settled over the ballroom once again. Margaret stepped forward and addressed the audience with steady confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, under the governing charter of Whitmore Crown Holdings, no transfer of operational authority may proceed without the written authorization of the controlling shareholder." She paused just long enough for every guest to absorb her words before continuing. "The controlling shareholder has reviewed the proposal." Every eye turned toward Daniel. Claire looked from Margaret to her husband, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. Preston's confidence finally began to crack. "Where is the shareholder?" he asked, forcing a polite smile that no longer appeared natural. Margaret met his eyes without hesitation. "He has been in this ballroom since the evening began." The room felt perfectly still. Daniel quietly removed the old stainless steel watch from beneath the sleeve of his canvas jacket and rested one hand upon the leather portfolio. Then Margaret turned toward him with the same respect she had shown for more than 2 decades and spoke the words that instantly transformed every assumption inside the ballroom. "Mr. Whitmore, as chairman and controlling owner of Whitmore Crown Holdings, the decision is yours." For several long seconds, nobody in the ballroom moved. The words Margaret Sloane had spoken seemed to suspend time itself. Conversations disappeared. The orchestra remained silent. Even the photographers standing near the stage lowered their cameras, unsure whether they had just witnessed the most important moment of the evening or the beginning of something even greater. Claire stared at Daniel as though she were seeing him for the first time. Every memory from the drive to the hotel returned at once. The old truck, the worn canvas jacket, the employee parking lot, her request that he stay out of sight. Suddenly, none of those moments felt ordinary anymore. They felt painfully clear. Preston forced a polite smile, but the confidence that had carried him through the evening was beginning to disappear. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said carefully. "I was informed that the ownership structure had already been delegated." Daniel looked at him without hostility. "You were informed incorrectly." His voice remained calm and measured, carrying naturally through the silent ballroom without the need for a microphone. "Ownership can be represented. Responsibility cannot." Preston attempted another smile. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." Daniel gently rested the portfolio on the podium. "The proposal was prepared for a public announcement. It deserves a public review." No one applauded. No one interrupted. The room seemed united by quiet curiosity. Daniel opened the portfolio once more and removed a single page. "This document estimates savings through workforce reductions. It lists departments, projected dates, and expected financial gains." He slowly lowered the page. "What it does not list are the names of the people behind those positions." He turned toward the audience seated near the back of the ballroom where many longtime employees were gathered. "There is a banquet supervisor who has worked here for 19 years. There is a housekeeper whose daughter graduated from nursing school because of this company's education assistance program. There is an engineer who volunteers every Saturday teaching high school students about building maintenance." His eyes returned to Preston. "Spreadsheets do not tell those stories." The room remained completely silent. Several guests lowered their eyes. Daniel continued in the same steady tone. "Every organization eventually faces a choice. It can measure success only by quarterly reports, or it can measure success by the lives it helps build. I chose my answer a long time ago." Claire felt her throat tighten. She remembered all the evenings Daniel had quietly left home to attend employee retirement dinners, scholarship ceremonies, and volunteer events. She had often wondered why he invested so much time in people who could never improve the company's public image. Standing there now, she finally understood. Those people were never a public relations strategy. They were the company itself. Preston cleared his throat before speaking again. "Business requires difficult decisions." Daniel nodded. "It does." He looked toward the employees seated throughout the ballroom. "That is why difficult decisions should never be made by someone who has never taken the time to know the people affected by them." Margaret stepped beside the podium and handed Daniel another folder. He opened it carefully before removing several photographs. They showed employees volunteering at food banks, mentoring students, rebuilding homes after storms, and organizing community events throughout South Carolina and Georgia. Daniel held up one photograph after another. "These are the returns I value most. They will never appear in a financial statement, yet they are the reason this company still exists." A quiet murmur spread across the room. Investors who had arrived expecting another predictable corporate announcement now found themselves listening to something far more meaningful. Daniel turned toward Claire. His expression remained gentle, without accusation or bitterness. "Earlier tonight, you asked me to park with the employees." Claire lowered her eyes, unable to answer. Daniel continued softly. "I did exactly that." He paused before offering the faintest smile. "It reminded me why I built this company in the first place." Claire looked up slowly. Tears gathered in her eyes, not from public embarrassment, but from the realization that she had spent the evening trying to distance herself from the very people who represented the values Daniel had spent his life protecting. Before anyone could speak again, the ballroom doors quietly opened. Owen walked inside carrying a weathered brown document case in both hands. He approached the stage with respectful confidence before stopping beside Margaret. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "I found this inside your truck after I noticed someone had tried to move it. I checked the security cameras before bringing it here." Daniel recognized the case immediately. It contained the original documents he had intended to present before the evening took its unexpected turn. Owen placed it carefully into Daniel's hands. Daniel thanked him with a grateful nod, but Owen's next sentence caused every person in the ballroom to look toward Preston at the very same moment. "There is something else you need to see, sir. The security footage shows that someone opened your truck before the gala began." The ballroom remained silent after Owen's words settled over the crowd. Daniel accepted the weathered document case without taking his eyes off the young valet. "Tell everyone exactly what happened," he said calmly. Owen nodded once. His voice was steady despite the hundreds of guests watching him. "After I parked Mr. Whitmore's truck, I completed my normal rounds in the employee parking area. About 20 minutes later, I noticed someone standing beside the truck. At first I assumed it was another valet, but when I checked the schedule, nobody had been assigned to that section. Several guests exchanged uneasy glances. Owen continued. I reviewed the security cameras before coming back to the ballroom. The footage shows one of Mr. Hale's executive assistants unlocking the driver's door with a duplicate access tool. He remained inside the truck for less than 1 minute before leaving. Preston immediately stepped forward. That proves nothing. My assistant may have mistaken the vehicle for another guest's truck. Daniel looked at him quietly. Then I am sure the footage will answer every remaining question. Margaret nodded toward the hotel's director of security, who had already arrived beside the stage carrying a tablet computer. Without speaking, he connected the device to the ballroom's presentation screen. The lights dimmed slightly as the recording appeared above the stage. Every guest watched in complete silence. The timestamp matched the period shortly after Daniel had parked in the employee lot. The camera clearly showed Preston's assistant approaching the blue Ford, looking carefully over both shoulders before opening the driver's door. He reached inside the cabin, examined a brown document case, removed several pages, replaced them with another set of papers, then quietly closed the door before walking away. Nobody spoke as the video ended. Daniel did not react with anger. He simply closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though disappointed more than surprised. Preston looked toward his assistant, who had quietly stepped backward into the crowd. I was not aware of this, Preston said quickly. If he acted without authorization, he did so entirely on his own. Before Daniel could answer, Owen spoke again. There is one more camera. The director of security nodded and displayed another recording taken from a hallway outside the executive lounge. The footage showed Preston's assistant entering the room several minutes after leaving the parking lot. Less than 30 seconds later, Preston himself entered the same room. They remained inside together for nearly 10 minutes before returning separately to the gala. The ballroom grew even quieter. Preston no longer attempted to smile. Daniel looked toward him with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the evening. Would you like to explain what was discussed during those 10 minutes? Preston hesitated before answering. Business strategy. Daniel gently rested one hand on the weathered document case. Then why replace documents that did not belong to you? Preston had no immediate answer. Claire felt the weight of every passing second. She remembered signing preliminary paperwork earlier that week after Preston assured her it involved routine planning. She had trusted his confidence instead of asking more questions. Looking at the altered documents now resting in Daniel's hands, she realized how easily confidence could disguise manipulation. Slowly, Claire stood from her chair. Every guest turned toward her. She walked toward the stage without rushing, stopping a few feet from Daniel. Her voice trembled slightly, but she refused to hide behind silence any longer. Daniel, she said softly, I need to tell everyone something. Daniel met her eyes without interrupting. Claire took a slow breath. I believed I was helping secure the future of this company. I allowed myself to admire certainty instead of asking difficult questions. I signed preliminary recommendations because I trusted promises that sounded successful. She looked toward the employees seated throughout the ballroom. I never read the workforce projections. I should have. I never asked how those decisions would affect the people who devoted their lives to this place. I should have. Tears filled her eyes, but her voice remained steady. Most of all, earlier tonight I treated my own husband as though appearances mattered more than character. That choice belongs to me alone. Nobody else is responsible for it. The room remained completely still. Daniel listened without interrupting. There was no satisfaction in seeing her admit those words publicly. Only sadness that they had become necessary. Claire slowly removed the event badge hanging around her neck and placed it upon the podium. If I am no longer worthy of the leadership role you plan to offer me, I understand. Daniel looked down at the original document case Owen had protected. Inside rested the presentation he had prepared weeks before the gala. It was not a property transfer. It was an appointment naming Claire as director of a new charitable foundation that would oversee employee scholarships, family assistance programs, and community partnerships across every Whitmore Crown property. Daniel closed the case without revealing its contents. Leadership, he said quietly, is never earned by standing on a stage. It is earned by the choices we make when nobody believes they are watching. He turned toward Owen, then toward the employees gathered throughout the ballroom. Tonight, one person with the least authority protected the truth, while several people with the greatest influence nearly allowed it to disappear. That difference tells me everything I need to know before I make my final decision. Daniel let the silence remain for a few moments after his final words. No one in the ballroom seemed eager to break it. The grand chandeliers still glowed above polished marble floors, but the evening no longer felt like a celebration of influence. It had become something far more personal. Daniel slowly opened the weathered document case one final time and removed a single cream-colored folder bearing the Whitmore crown seal. He looked first at Claire, then at the employees seated throughout the ballroom, before speaking with the same calm voice that had guided the company from its earliest days. Several weeks ago, I prepared these documents because I believed tonight would mark the beginning of a new chapter. He held up the folder just high enough for those closest to see it. This is not a property transfer. It never was. Curious whispers moved through the audience. Daniel continued. It is the charter for a new foundation dedicated to employee education, family assistance, emergency relief, and community service. I intended to ask Claire to lead it. Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment. She had expected disappointment. She had never imagined the opportunity she almost received. Daniel gently lowered the folder. Leadership is not about receiving authority. It is about becoming worthy of it. He turned toward Claire with kindness rather than anger. Tonight showed me that you still have that journey ahead of you. Claire nodded slowly, tears filling her eyes once again. You are right. She did not attempt to defend herself. She did not ask for another chance. She simply accepted the truth. Daniel appreciated that more than any apology. He looked toward the audience once again. This foundation will still be created. The difference is that nobody will lead it until they have first served beside the people it exists to support. Claire looked up, surprised. Daniel continued. If you still wish to accept that responsibility someday, you will begin where every meaningful career in this company begins. Claire already understood his meaning before he finished speaking. Alongside the employees, she answered quietly. Daniel smiled. Exactly. There was no humiliation in his words. Only fairness. Claire nodded without hesitation. I will do it. Daniel believed her because, for the first time that evening, she spoke without worrying about who might be listening. He then turned toward Owen, who still stood respectfully near the stage. Owen Reed. The young valet straightened immediately. Yes, sir. Daniel walked over and extended his hand. Owen accepted it with visible humility. Tonight you protected property that was never yours, not because someone instructed you to, but because you believed honesty mattered. Owen answered softly. My father always said that character is what you protect when nobody knows your name. Daniel smiled warmly. Your father taught you well. The audience applauded for the first time all evening, but this applause felt different. It was not for wealth. It was not for power. It was for integrity. Daniel waited until the applause faded before continuing. Beginning next week, Owen will join our leadership development program. He has earned the opportunity to grow, not because he recognized the owner, but because he protected the truth before he knew anyone else would. Owen's eyes filled with grateful emotion. Thank you, sir. I will do everything I can to deserve it. Daniel nodded. I believe you already have. He then addressed the board of directors. The proposed restructuring is rejected in its entirety. Every employee whose future was placed on a spreadsheet tonight deserves better than to become a number. Several long-time employees quietly wiped away tears while others smiled with visible relief. Daniel looked toward Preston one final time. His voice remained respectful. Business partnerships require trust. Trust cannot exist where honesty has been replaced by manipulation. Therefore, Whitmore Crown will not move forward with your proposal. Preston lowered his eyes. There was nothing left to argue. The decision had already been made by facts rather than emotion. Several months later, visitors arriving at the Whitmore Crown Grand Hotel noticed something unusual. The employee parking lot had been repaved, landscaped, and connected to the main entrance by a beautifully lit walkway lined with flowering trees. A new sign stood near the entrance, engraved with a simple sentence that every guest passed before entering the lobby. It read, "Every person who walks through these doors deserves the same respect." On a cool autumn evening, an aging blue Ford F-150 quietly rolled into the employee parking area once again. Daniel stepped out wearing the same canvas jacket and the same stainless steel watch. Owen, now participating in leadership training, smiled as he approached. Good evening, Mr. Whitmore. The front entrance has plenty of space if you would like me to move your truck. Daniel slipped the keys into Owen's hand before looking toward the warmly lit hotel, where employees and guests entered through different doors but were welcomed with equal dignity. He smiled peacefully and shook his head. No, Owen. This is exactly where I belong. Because every great hotel begins here, long before any guest ever reaches the lobby.